Our final panel explores resilience at the intersection of climate, land use, public health, ecology, and community planning. This panel brings together expertise spanning climate science, urban design, public health, ecology, and resilience planning, reflecting the university's ability to convene different forms of knowledge around shared resilience goals and long-term adaptation strategies. Moderating today's discussion is Andy Jones, who is the science advisor to the California Natural Resources Secretary. He's joined by Alex Hall, our keynote speaker from earlier, Travis Longcore, who's the Senior Associate Director of UCLA's Institute for the Environment and Sustainability, David Eisenman, who's Professor in Residence at the Geffen School of Medicine and of Community Health Sciences at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health and Director of UCLA Center for Public Health and Disasters. We had to get all his titles in there, and I think we still left some out. And then, of course, Jeffrey Inaba, who's an adjunct professor of architecture and urban design at UCLA. Thank you, and welcome our panel.
All right, is this on? Yes. Okay, so hey everyone. I'm Andy Jones. As was mentioned, I'm the science advisor to the California Natural Resources Agency, and that's a new role that was just created. I've been doing it since January. Prior to that, I spent 15 years at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory building a research team there called the Earth Systems and Society Lab. And in that work, I started as a Earth systems modeler, a climate scientist, a little bit like Alex, and started asking questions, how can we better inform water resource management or electricity grid planning or urban planning? And so that led us to ask questions about the built environment, infrastructure. Then we started asking, if we're going to actually engage with decision makers, how do we design better social engagements between academics and practitioners in order to elicit what the research questions are and what the needs are. And that brought us into decision science framings to ask, if we look at different scenarios or analyze risks and trade-offs, what kinds of methods can we bring to that? So just in my own experience as a PI, I saw how starting with a problem, we had to bring more and more disciplines and more expertise to the table in order to really get at those. And so I really resonate with the overall framing of this event around interdisciplinarity, engagement, collision of different perspectives. And so now I've taken that and I'm serving in this kind of unique role as the first science advisor to Secretary Wade Crowfoot, who leads the Natural Resources Agency. And if you're not familiar with that agency, it's a mega agency that reports directly to the governor, and it oversees CAL FIRE and the Department of Water Resources and Fish and Wildlife and state parks. So many things related to natural resources and environment in California are under the umbrella of one mega agency. And, I've seen that just like in universities, there's these silos between different areas of expertise. There's certainly silos between the Energy Commission and the Department of Water Resources. But the fact that there is this institutional mechanism for coordination allows for there to be policy objectives that cut across those. So, for instance, the state has this 30 by 30 goal to conserve 30% of the land for biodiversity by 2030, and that cuts across those departments, and likewise the climate resilience goals cut across the departments. And so there's really is, at this moment, an interest in Sacramento, I would say, in engagement with the research community, with the science community. There's a hunger for thought partnership. There's a hunger for collaboration. So it's not a question of why or what, but how we do that work. And so I think that is brings us to this specific topic of wildfire resilience. And we've been circling around this concept of resilience all day. And Alex framed really nicely this idea of collision. And so what we're going to do here on the panel is do some collision. We have experts from public health, climate science, the built environment, architecture, community engagement. And so hopefully we can get a little alignment and move a little bit towards action in the panel. And so, we've been circling around resilience, and resilience is kind of this like squishy, feel-good topic, term that everybody wants resilience, but it means many different things. And I think for me, it has something to do with systems transformation, with adaptability, flexibility. But what we want to do now is kind of hear from each of our panelists about a perspective they bring to what wildfire resilience might look like in urban environments, and what expertise they're bringing to that and what experience they've had about the challenge of resilience. So we'll start with David Eisenman, who is the director of UCLA's Center for Public Health and Disasters and co-director of the Center for Healthy Climate Solutions.
Yeah, well, thank you. This has really been a great day. So kudos to the organizers. So yeah, how do I think about resilience? And let's just sort of start with that. I've been a disaster researcher now for 25 years. And one thing we've learned about all disasters, across disasters, is that governments are quickly overwhelmed, right? The needs of the suffering society and community quickly outstrip the available resources. But what always happens is that at the community level, new organizations either emerge. This was an idea from sociologists named Quarantelli and Dines. Either new organizations emerge from the grassroots to address those, or old organizations, existing organizations, repurpose themselves, extend themselves into new areas to address the community needs. So we recognized this, but we hadn't started to really use this idea until about 15 years ago, when resilience started to really pop up in my field after we were focused on individual household disaster preparedness. And the question was now, can we develop community resilience? So we really, first of all, said, what is community resilience? So to us, it wasn't the idea of just being able to deal with a stress and return to the original equilibrium. That was an older idea that actually comes back from engineering principles in the 17th century. We were taking actually from the environmental literature, from Crawford Hollings. I haven't looked at this, so I had to write it down. Ecological resilience was this idea that systems, complex systems, they need to, when they come under stress, they need to change, and then they adapt, and then they persist. And they don't just return to an equilibrium. This got turned in around 2009 into federal ideas, into federal, I'm not sure how to say this, but turned into federal codified documents, both at FEMA and in the Health and Human Services Commission services, which was the idea of national health security and community resilience. And the idea was that community resilience would address how communities can prevent, protect, mitigate, respond, and recover through all phases of the disaster, and then not just return to the normal, but actually bounce forward. And you might have heard that phrase that became very popular back in those days, bouncing forward. Using new knowledge to strengthen, change, learn, and improve. We turned that in Los Angeles into a project called the Los Angeles County Community Disaster Resilience Project, where we actually said, okay, how do you then turn this into on-the-ground action? And we could talk a little more details about that later on, but basically we went into 16 communities across Los Angeles, and here we had a partnership between UCLA, Department of Public Health, RAND, a bunch of community organizations, and we said, what does it mean to develop and implement a community resilience project? And importantly, can we evaluate it and see what kind of outcomes we can get? And I'll tell you some lessons later on, but it's clear to me that one lesson is that the university can play a major role in that.
Great, excellent. Yeah, let's just head down the line to hear from Alex next.
Okay, so nice to collide with you here, David. I have a totally different perspective. Not that I disagree with what you said, but I'm just going to wear my environmentalist and physical scientist hat here. And I think the way that I think about resilience is working with nature instead of trying to control it or work against it. And we've had some progress in the wildfire space in that realm, especially in our forests, in our forested ecosystems, which are much of the western U.S. We had a history of fire suppression in these ecosystems, and that led up to a big buildup of fuels, which has unfortunately made them produce much larger fires in the past few years, in addition to increasing temperatures, which have also caused them to be larger and more ferocious. But essentially, these are fuel-limited ecosystems, and if there's more fuel there, they will burn. There will be more intense fires. So the strategy there is to work with nature, is to restore the forest to its ecological equilibrium, which means having there be less fuel there. That means introducing controlled fires and thinning in the forests. So that's been great. I think that's really, there's a consensus now that we need to do that, and that really is working with the ecology there. The thing is that here in Southern California, we have a very different ecosystem and a very different fire regime. So these are shrublands, chaparral primarily, that surround urban Los Angeles, and the fires that occur here, the catastrophic fires, are wind-driven when we have very big Santa Ana events. And so whenever there's an ignition event that coincides with a big Santa Ana event, that can produce a catastrophic fire. And that happens almost, not quite, but almost regardless of how much fuel there is. So these are not fuel-driven fires, they're wind and ignition-driven fires. So the question then is, well, how do we work with nature to reduce risk in that context? And where I've landed on that question is, we have to think about, first of all, reducing ignitions. Because if you look at where the ignitions are, they are primarily next to roads, so where people have tossed cigarette butts that are alive, or vehicles have produced sparks. They are adjacent to power lines where there's been inadvertent production of sparks. Or they're associated with people being in the wildlands and producing ignitions through campfires or other types of ignition-producing tools. And so, we've also had gender reveal parties that involve pyrotechnics here in Southern California that have produced big fires, and other ways that humans have produced these ignitions. So basically, most of our ignitions that are leading to these fires are the result of our activity. And that means that we have a way to control it. If we are producing the ignitions, then we can reduce them also. So things like having power line shutoffs when there is a dangerous event, and I think that does mean that we have to figure out how we collectively define when a dangerous event is happening. I think that means probably during a dangerous event, it means making sure that there isn't access to wildlands so people can't light fires. It means making sure that we don't have vehicles traveling through wildlands when there's a big event. Those are the strategies that I think we need to adopt to reduce wildfire risk and in this region, and also become more resilient. And of course, there's always going to be fire, and so in addition, we also need strategies like home hardening to protect people and structures when there is a fire. So that's my thoughts on it. Is we need to think about working with nature and not against it.
Excellent. Moving along down the row here, we have Travis Longcore, who is the Senior Associate Director and Adjunct Professor in the Institute of Environment and Sustainability.
Great, thank you. Great event today. It's kind of like being at a high school reunion where there's like somebody at every table you want to talk to and catch up with. It's really a marvelous room to be in today. I think I probably should give a little background about some of the perspective that I have on this before I get into it, because I'm a geographer, biogeographer. I kind of caucus with the ecologists, publish in ecology. Most people probably know me more from working on urban nature and conservation, restoration, effects of light at night, et cetera, et cetera. And also this results in me getting criticized when I go into rooms and start talking about fire. Well, what's this guy know? Just for the record, my co-advisor here at UCLA, right? So PhD here at UCLA, was a fire ecologist. And been thinking about this for a very long time. I also was appointed to the LA County Environmental Review Board as a graduate student. I took Ed Bagley Jr.'s spot on that board. And so I have seen every single discretionary development in the Santa Monica Mountains since the 90s that had to get a coastal development permit that was in the county version. And in that process, this is hundreds of projects, development projects. And on the board also is the LA County Fire. And so we have talked a lot about what it takes for a lot of years about safety. And one of the things they notice over that is that, and we would get to the point where we would tell applicants, is there are spots that we saw 2 proposals for because it was burned out when I came on the board. Somebody built there, it burned out again, and it came back to the board to be built again. So frequent flyer sites. And we would tell people also when they're trying to develop, down a mile driveway off to some remote things, like, you are on your own and it is going to burn. There is no question. In the time that you own that home, if you stay more than a year, it is going to at some point going to burn. Which gets to this issue of there are some places that are just inherently dangerous, and they are going to burn. And resilience, and coming from the ecology side of this conversation, it isn't about resisting the disaster. The disasters happen in ecology. Hurricanes happen, storms and fires, they happen. It's about the response to it. And then I think our piece as humans, as we start to change this, is like, let's maybe not make the actual disturbances worse, which gets to Alex's point here about ignitions. But we have to go forward recognizing that some of these places are inherently dangerous, they're high risk, and there's nothing you can do that's going to make it low risk, which leads to land use decisions. Because I think we're at a point in the conversation right now with things like Zone 0 regulations, et cetera, where we're willing to go into the individual parcel level and say, you make this as absolutely as good as possible as it can be, but starting to ignore the land use decision that put that development there in the first place. And that's the hard one. And even Deputy Mayor Winston this morning talked about, well, we're implementing all of these things in order to make it safer. But there is a rule that the city of LA is not implementing, just to be provocative, which is the state minimum fire safe regulations, which say you cannot build on a new property unless you have an access road that has more than 20-foot continuous paved roadway to the edge of the very high fire hazard severity zone. So if you're on because you can't evacuate and get fire apparatus in at the same time. And it explicitly says at the state level, and they knew it when they passed the rule at the state level, you can't build there. If we're going to get to the point we want to reduce these risks and manage these risks, we need to actually be willing to talk about the land use piece of it and not think that it can be atomized out to every individual property and solved on a property by property basis. And I'll leave it there for now, because I'm sure we'll come back to it.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Inaba. For the way our work proceeds is with the understanding that resilience is agility. It's being agile in all circumstances, and trained as an architect and practicing architecture and teaching architecture here at UCLA. My predilection is to look at things on a local level and a pragmatic level. So to give you an example of what that means in terms of being effective and creating impact, recently we were asked to do a study to do an urban master plan for a hillside community here. And so just procedurally as a starting point, we had a workshop with the community, and it became suddenly clear that an urban infrastructure plan to look at ingress, egress, areas of brush vulnerability was not what was urgent. And instead, what they were looking for were actionable things that the community could do And so we went from thinking that we would design an infrastructure plan to designing processes, community processes in the form of a user guide of what residents will need to do, will want to do in case there is an emergency, a fire event. And being able to be agile and nimble to pivot as academics is something that was a really, really great lesson to learn. And so we're now actually working with a number of communities to do this. And learning what communities want has been such an enormous learning curve in terms of how to present information. So it's not just about, okay, well, here are a set of protocols that community will follow. It's about how to present that information in a way where any resident in that community can go to an information source and see just what they can do that given day, or how their individual actions could contribute to the larger community fire safety. And I can go into further detail of what that exactly means and how specific urgencies or how urgencies are really specific to Canyon communities.
Great, thank you all. So one of the things I've noticed in my short time in state government has been that many of the policy instruments we have are incremental, right? So we give a grant out to do a fuels treatment on this piece of land, or we incentivize the restoration of a wetland here, or we build a bridge there to connect wildlife. But the outcomes that we're going for are these kind of like systems level, landscape level, community level outcomes. And it's a theme that I heard a lot in what from each of you said is that these are collective action problems. They involve the community working together. They involve, treatments across, land use and across the entire landscape. So I guess I'm wondering, what have you learned about, again, I guess this is how, right? Less what, but how. How do we get to those from the incremental to the holistic outcomes? How do we understand the holistic, and how do we achieve those? That's really for anyone.
Well, I'll start as a typical academic for the moment and then transition into more the implementer. I think you have to actually start with a good theory. Good theory is a roadmap. With our resilience work, we started with a theory of what is community resilience. And it listed all sorts of factors, including factors that are more easily modifiable, things you can actually push down on and change, and things that are harder to get at for a community, things that are more structural. And so with a theory like that, you can actually then isolate what are the levers that you're going to push upon in your community resilience approach. So we actually focused on a few that we thought we could do, okay? One is that you needed to have a multi-sectoral approach. And so what does that mean? Well, we actually divided the world into sectors. We said when it comes to humans, there are different sectors. There's social services, there's mental health, there's faith-based, there's emergency management, there's urban planning, there's probably 4 or 5 others. There's certainly 5 or 6 others. And all of those need to be at the table. Second of all, you need community engagement. The community has to be very involved in bi-directional conversation at all stages. Okay, and that's going to be both for trust building as well as for really surfacing the solutions, the assets, the strengths in the community that you're going to be, again, pushing down on levering, using for change. And third, we said that because disasters really predominantly affect the most vulnerable, you need to have an equity lens throughout this entire process. And each community needs to really very diligently define for itself who are the different vulnerable populations, not just by age and race and gender, but also by geography, by other factors, and make sure that they are represented, they're at the table, talking for themselves, representing their own interests. And you have to know that the process, because you have all these sectors and all these disparate groups in the room, the first year of your work is going to entail some friction. There's going to be different languages used. And I don't mean like English and Spanish. I mean, actually, the way we talk about things, we frame them differently. So it's going to take a while for us to come to a common language. And there's going to be friction, there'll be distrust that develops, but over time, and we've measured this, trust increases. And that throughout this entire process, the university is really well positioned to be a leader, okay? So it can be, someone talked about conveners, we can be conveners of this. We can be facilitators of that bi-directional engagement. We can be, at times, teaching about resilience and sort of helping orient the group there. One of the things with resilience is that you want to reach beyond the community's already existing networks of organizations and people in it and reach out beyond it, say to powers in government, powers at the state level. So universities can help extend those partnerships, identify those partnerships. And importantly, evaluate, because you really do want to see, in sort of a quick response way, you want to see where you're making inroads, where you're having trouble, where you need to pivot and adapt and change your approach.
I see Jeffrey.
I would just sort of try to present a lens of scaling versus systems. Like that, it could start at the level of an individual home, like home hardening. One resident realizes, okay, if I home harden, this is going to be good for me, but it's also possibly going to be good for my neighbor, and that a conversation can start about how incrementally you can begin to home harden in such a way where 2 or 3 homes are now safer because of the way that their shared fences are designed, or that the sides of their houses are designed. And that can scale to be something where an entire block realizes that they're going to be safer. And so in that way, thinking of how residents can scale up from their individual home is something that we've been interested in developing. And a good example of this would be that these workshops that we do, they're about intaking information and then trying to crystallize it in such a way that allows communities to operate and maintain for themselves fire responsive plans. But those workshops are also generative in that they lead to actions that not only help that community, but could help at scale a much broader group. And one of those is that one of the residents said, well, actually, how do you retrofit a home? How do you fire protect a home? Which has led us to a study where we're now implementing affordable fire-resistant details. And the point of that is not to obviously fireproof a home, because that's not possible. It's not. It's just to make sure that ignition risks are minimized. And the idea is not to be holistic, that you've got to do boxed awnings, et cetera, that you could start simple, and you could use affordable materials that you can get at Home Depot, and you might decide that you can only afford one thing this year, but next year you might do other things. And that level of communication, of working incrementally at the home level, can then scale to a series of residents that could scale to a block, and so on and so forth. And in that way, what we've been able to do in many instances is to circumvent the good work that's done at the policy level, the good work that's done in terms of building codes and enforcement, but rather to work from the side of motivation of residents and see if we can build that way rather than from restrictive enforcing ways.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, if I can introduce a metaphor here. Everyone knows what fractals are. these patterns that are the same at different scales. And I've been thinking about this relative to conservation, but I think it applies here as well, that we need a fractal approach to all this, meaning we need big plans at the state and national and international level, but at every single level going down, you also need plans, and you need networks, and you need people engaged. And you might initially go, well, that's repetitive and redundant, and why would you need that? But fractals in nature are incredibly powerful, resilient structures. And that redundancy, ecological redundancy, is not seen as a problem. Ecological systems are redundant. And now, I mean, in the last, deep sigh, decade of my life here, it used to be we would think, state of California doesn't list insects on their Endangered Species Act, and it's not a big deal because the federal government does, and that'll be there and no problem. A little redundancy would have been really great to have built into our systems that rely on federal government doing certain things that now the federal government has abdicated doing. And so thinking about this as multi-scalar fractal redundancy is a metaphor that gets us from individuals doing what they can to contribute to make the system resilient, that your street does, and your neighborhood association does, and your city council district maybe does, and that there's a county-wide plan for fire resilience, but there's also a localized plan, like what you're working on in Mandeville, for example. So I think that multi-scalar fractal idea may be a way to think about how we build resilience.
And just to add on here, I think what I heard from the other panelists too is that just how complicated this business is, both in terms of the scope of sectors and disciplines involved, and the number of people and the scales. And what I think about a lot too is how you make it tractable. How do you, because we don't have room for endless complexity. We have to draw boundaries around problems. And so I think, in the case of Southern California, it's clear that we have a unique fire regime, and our communities are uniquely vulnerable. And so we need our own space to talk about this. And I think once you draw that kind of a boundary, then you can unlock, I think, a really productive conversation like what we're having today, where it really is worth our time to take time out of our jobs and our disciplines and our silos and to step into a space and engage collaboratively, because we agree what the problem is, and the problem has been crisply defined in some sense for us. So I think thinking about the problem definition and is really key to unlocking productive collaborations also.
Great. Well, that's a great segue into the next topic I wanted to talk about. But I would say that you've all illustrated really beautifully like the value of this kind of academic, theoretical, abstract thinking, right? And that I don't think most policymakers would understand what they're doing as being part of a fractal, but having a framework where we can understand that complexity, and it's useful, right? But then we have to collide that with the very practical. And I think, Jeffrey, you had an example of, where you start with the really incremental, the motivation of an individual homeowner and how that can scale up to community action. So I think these examples illustrate the value of having these different perspectives, and that I've often reflected in my own work that, academics have the luxury of thinking 50 years into the future and thinking about systems that aren't, what is immediately on the table that we need to create policy around today, and the value of that thought partnership. And so the theme of this entire what do we call it, a symposium today, is, the university as innovation partner. And so I wanted to ask, and I think, David, you also touched on this a little bit already, about how you've, each of you have in your work done engagement with communities and with policymakers, and your insights into what makes for effective collaboration. And David, you touched on, building trust and getting over that friction, but I would love to hear for other perspectives on doing effective engagement outside of the ivory tower.
Well, I think that I can just jump in here and start it. Obviously, I think we have to first and foremost be useful to the world outside. And I think in this particular space, from my perspective anyway, one of the most useful things I can do is help to quantify the risks that we face, so that, for example, in California and Southern California, we have an understanding of what the likelihood is of these types of catastrophes occurring. And I think just as importantly, to quantify the impact of different strategies to reduce that risk. So if we target certain types of ignitions, then I think that we want to know what the benefit that is going to be to our collective risk. And likewise, if we have resources to harden structures in a community, what is the impact on the risk? And I think that's very important, not only to protect lives and property, but also to create a functioning insurance market, which we don't have right now. And largely that's because there's so much uncertainty around risk. So I think, being useful, and I'm just trying to give an example of what useful means in this context. I think that's the most important way that we can engage with folks. And that means that we have to dialogue with them. So right now, we have a conversation going at UCLA with a consortium of insurance companies. And that the purpose there is to try to help identify what the problems are from their perspective and what we can do to help. And what I articulated is an example of that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so I've spent a lot of time, not strictly in the academy, doing nonprofit work and stuff that's outside as well. And so maybe my perspective isn't the same as one would have if I were of an orientation to just be doing the science and whatnot. But in all aspects, I think part of this is making sure that we are doing things that folks want to know. First of all, trying to figure out things that people really want to know, and listening and knowing the policy issues well enough to fine-tune our scientific questions to make sure that we're answering them. And so there's a poster for the session. We're looking at the effect of Zone 0 on structure loss in Palisades and Eaton fires. There's already been 2 published papers on from other groups on forests and trees and structure loss in those 2 fires. But the way we've scheduled, and I'll call it Will Coleman, who's sitting over there, a PhD candidate in geography, who's been working on that with some internal UCLA funding and a bunch of collaborators, is designing that so that we really took the time to try to figure out how do we get at measuring a signal of vegetation versus trees, because they're kind of 2 different things, low vegetation versus trees, so shrubs and grass, and specifically Zone 0, Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3, like in actual regulatory terms. Like, so if you're making a policy about Zone 0, and just to tell you right now, there is the most important thing for your structure surviving in either of those fires is how you've built your home, so the home hardening piece, and then how much fuel in terms of other homes there is in your Zone 1 area. So that's your big risk. We found if you take Zone 0 as a whole, trees and vegetation, around every structure in these 2 fires, analyzed separately, so these are like 2 separate things, as a whole there was really no effect. If you divide it out into the Zone 0 vegetation that's on the north half of the structure versus the Zone 0 vegetation and trees that's on the south half of the structure, in both fires, separately analyzed, there is a small but significant negative effect of trees and vegetation within 5 feet on the upwind side. You're like, oh, well, maybe that's, what they're talking about. But you go to the Eaton fire, there was actually a negative relationship between the amount of tree cover over the house and whether the house was lost. or the structure was lost. We're just looking at residential structures, which suggests maybe there's this ember catching thing that's going on. First time anybody's really found that in a study. Wasn't present in the Palisades fire, probably because of sort of different trees and ecology, percentage of oaks and that sort of thing. Now, we got to get this through peer review, preliminary results, all this sort of thing. But I think because we've couched it in very specific terms that map one-to-one onto a policy conversation, that we will be able to help move that along more than if we weren't so engaged across and being engaged in these conversations in things like the meetings that Nareed has convened, and being in the room with people who want answers to those questions. So I think it's about being very intentional in how you go about doing your science. It's the same science, but you got to have those connections and make sure you're answering the right questions.
And just, sorry to interrupt just quickly, but I think that's the type of granularity that we need. I think the state has a little bit of a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to hazard mitigation, and especially when it comes to wildfire. And, if you look at a forest fire and a wind-driven fire in the chaparral, they're very different contexts. And the way that you mitigate risk in those two different situations is going to be very different. And I think even between the Palisades and Eaton fires, Travis is talking about there's a difference. And so we have for planning like solar panels and stuff like that, we have such granularity at the parcel level for how people position these assets. And I think we need something very similar for wildfire, so that we're mitigating risk at the parcel level that in a way that's tailored for the meteorology and the conditions there. And that's informed by the history of fire and the history of climate at that location, so that we can be a lot smarter about the strategies that we employ. It really makes sense for us to be that granular, I think.
Yeah, so I hear from both of you this idea of asking the right questions, right? And I often think of it as, science is a flashlight, and we can shine that light. We can illuminate anything we want with this flashlight, but where do we actually shine it? And so I guess, maybe Jeffrey, you can add on this, is like, how do we know where to shine the light?
Right, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think we go about things blindly and see where problems arise and try to address them. But it is about collaboration in a way where you try to move things along, like what Travis and Alex are talking about. To figure out how to do effective, affordable, fire-resistant details, we went to a fire scientist and said, well, do you have to have ember guard vents? Do you have to have gutters that have these super expensive Vulcan features that allow for the protection of embers? And his response was, hell no. We worked with him to figure out, okay, well, what is something that's going to be fairly effective, like not something that's going to cost thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to fire harden. So we worked with them. We came up with what we thought were really good practices. And through this interdisciplinary collaboration, we realized that this fire scientist had been working on this topic, ignition resistance, for something like 25 years. And the informational gap in his work was having an architect being able to draw these drawings in such a way where they were specific enough that a contractor would be able to read it. And this kind of unfolded to a series of incremental progressive steps. One was, okay, we're not going to be able to get any kind of standardized approval for what are fire-resistant, ignition-resistant details. So let's go to people who actually look at burn structures after a disaster. And so we've been working with the Community Brigade, their LA County Fire Department certified for fighting fires. What they mainly do is inspect homes post-fire to understand how fires have occurred. And so we're getting kind of the boots on the ground information of just where are locations where ignition starts and how sustained ignition leads to combustion. And so we're working with them. We're trying to establish best practices. And so toward that end, we're trying to test these things on a more immediate level. But at the same time, we're also trying to work with IBHS, not to get any kind of overall standard, but to understand what, from their perspective, is something that they see, or just what are the priorities in terms of getting to a standard. And that's exactly what happened with seismic retrofitting, that it wasn't like there was a law, okay, you have to seismic retrofit, and these are the details that you need to do. It took literally from the 71 earthquake to the 94 earthquake to get a developed set of standards that were deemed to be relatively effective. And since the 94 earthquake, they've progressively refined. And so what we want to do is get the idea of ignition-resistant retrofitting into that pipeline of feedback from organizations that hopefully at some larger time down the line that there would be greater impact.
Fascinating. And before we open it up, I wanted to give you a chance, David. I know you've done a lot of work with communities. Do you have any reflections on what makes for an effective engagement between academics and communities?
Well, I think the one thing that needs to be addressed was alluded to earlier, which is sustainability. As someone said earlier, there's a lot of energy in the year and a half after the fires, and now people are feeling exhausted, including the academics. We come together, we collectivize, we emerge as a community after the fire. UCLA is a public institution, but we don't fund ourselves. We don't resource ourselves for the long term. And research on disasters, time and time again, shows that the entire recovery phase, no matter what aspect of it you look at, is underfinanced. And we're now feeling that experience now. So what we should really be thinking about is when we're going to be responding as a public institution to disasters again and again. We need to really make sure that we get from our funders and from our supporters not just funding, not just the resources for the year when we're all going to have the energy and be excused from our daily work to do the work, but for the year afterwards. And that's probably the year where, the PI steps back a little bit and the communications director is more on and some of the other staff is more on and, the faculty's got a little 5%, 1%, 2% to help out. But we need to recognize this issue of our being overstretched and structure our response as institutions, as a field, differently so that we can actually be there for the communities long term.
Well, that's especially, I think, fascinating in the context of Jeffrey mentioning that it took the decades that it took to get this seismic regulations in place. And so certainly, in it for the long haul. And on that note, I wanted to try something with the panel, just a speed round, just to leave us with your final thoughts, so in 30 seconds or less. The theme of this, again, has been university as an innovation partner. And so what is one compelling next step, action or topic that can be taken in order to advance wildfire resilience?
So I'm going to say 5 words. University as convener, facilitator, teacher, connector, and evaluator. We have a lot to do. We can do it on all those fronts when we're talking about community resilience. So I'll say it again for those taking notes. Convener, facilitator, teacher, connector, evaluator.
That's good. I would just say that we have the scientific tools to quantify wildfire risk and the tools to quantify the risk reduction, and the bottleneck is implementing those and getting us all coordinated around them. I think so. That's my quick statement.
trusted networks. In an era where being untrustworthy is a political strategy, we need trusted networks more than ever.
I think the university could be a place that trains contractors and landscape service companies to do fire-resistant details, and especially contractors that work in those neighborhoods that know the specific preferences and desires of residents.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you. Can we give a round of applause for our panel today, please? Thank you all.